Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm just going to give a few minutes to allow people to get linked in here. It'll just take a minute. We're adding pretty quickly, so just give us a minute and we'll get started. We're going to end promptly today, so this won't reflect any of the time that we have for the webinar. So good to see everyone joining us on a Friday afternoon. This is extremely important topic. And today we actually have a terrific panel, actually a very unique panel led by Laura Schumacher. Laura is the exact right person for this particular webinar, legal priorities versus external communication needs, building a win-win partnership. And what we have today is a very unique panel that includes former CLO and obviously people coming from the PR firms themselves. Laura, as I mentioned, perfect person to lead this panel, talking about crisis and crisis management. She formerly was the vice chairman of external affairs and the CLO of AbbVie, and currently sits as board member to General Dynamics and CrowdStrike. So when it comes to crisis management, we have someone who's been battle tested, that's for sure. So it's good to have everyone here. This is a very important topic. If you have to leave early, or if you have any colleagues that are interested in hearing the panel afterward, we will be recording today. The GC Advantage program is something that we're extremely proud of here at BarkerGilmore, complimentary professional development program. Today, we have actually a really unique program where we're looking for it to be question-driven. So here you have at your disposal 3 experts that if you were going to reach out to these people, it would cost you thousands of dollars in consulting fees. Instead, you have at your disposal today 3 experts who are happy to help and give their perspective. So feel free to answer or ask questions as we move along, and then we'll be answering throughout the presentation today. The one thing I wanted to just mention, we're just finishing a really strong year here at BarkerGilmore. Interesting enough, one of the things that's really made our business boom is the combining the executive search with the coaching and advising from these former general counsel who are just absolutely spectacular. The reviews are off the charts. So just a really unique opportunity. And one thing I wanted to make sure everyone understands, we're looking for support and input from out in the field. So this year we will be reaching out to people, asking for their opinions on some of these important topics, or even looking for guests for our webinar. So please be responsive, and anything that you can offer will not only be beneficial to us putting these programs together, but certainly everyone out in the legal community. As you can tell, and Avro's jumping the gun or trying to keep up with me, I'm a terrible person when it comes to scripts. So, so keep with us today. Again, please ask questions. We have at your disposal these experts who are happy to help. And all that said, I'm going to be passing it over to Laura. Again, Laura is just pride and joy of our team. We're thrilled and just blessed to have her on the BarkerGilmore a team of search consultants and coaches. So all that said, Laura, thank you so much. We'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, John. I almost feel like maybe I should say nothing more after that great introduction, because it can only go downhill. But in any event, thank you, and we're happy that you have all joined us. The 3 of us together have unique and different perspectives on this particular issue. We asked each other, and we asked John if we were supposed to give you the Holy Grail on exactly what it is that's going to make the relationships between the communications team and the legal team click. And we know that there is no one answer, but we've put together what we believe to be some best practices or things that in our collective experience would be good to keep in mind when dealing with these issues. As John mentioned, I recently retired as the vice chairman of external affairs for a pharmaceutical company. In that role, I was also the chief legal officer, but I also had responsibility for brand and communications, for health economics and outcomes research, government affairs, compliance, a number of functions, but most relevant for what we're talking about today, obviously legal and communications. Our other panelists include Jim Haggerty. Jim is the CEO of PRCG, an internationally known public relations firm specializing in financial and professional services, litigation, crisis matters, and other key matters. He's also written a number of articles and books, including most recently In the Court of Public Opinion, Winning Strategies for Litigation Communications, as well as Chief Crisis Officer, Structure and Leadership for Effective Communications and Response. Additionally, we have Effie Delimarkos. Effie also has a very distinguished career in a number of different communications roles, both for-profit and non-for-profit, and she currently is the CEO of, a founder and CEO, I should say, of Big Wide Blue Communications, a position or a firm that she's founded for a number of years, as well as the former Vice President, Corporate Communications for Boy Scouts of America, and as I mentioned, a number of other roles. So collectively, I think the three of us have seen a lot and hopefully have a lot that we can share on this conundrum. And I call it a conundrum because I think, speaking with the CLO hat on, the issue oftentimes with communications is that the lawyer instinct in all of us lawyers is to say nothing. And the reason that's our instinct is because we know, first and foremost, that whatever we say, we're going to have to live with. And oftentimes communication occurs in a situation where there is incomplete information. And one of the things I should mention is earlier in my career, before I was the CLO, I also ran the litigation department for a pharmaceutical company. And so I know very well that communications, litigation, and the challenges to try to respond can be very difficult. But the first kind of takeaway that we wanted to sort of put out there and elaborate on is it is critical that both functions, that is the legal function and the communications function, understand and respect the perspective, meaning the legal perspective or the instinct to say nothing, to protect the company and protect what we don't know is obviously important, and it's one that should be at least understood. But the other side of it is, in any issue or communication challenge, if nothing is said, the story will be written for you. And so understanding that there is a very important need to get out there and to overcome what might be an instinctual reluctance to say something is pretty critical. I'll turn this over now to Jim to elaborate on this. And happy you as well.
Sure. Well, I'll start, and I'll just make the point that, you know, we've looked at this very closely, and for one of the books, Chief Crisis Officer, we actually looked at the types of crises that became real front burner issues. I think we looked at more than 1,000 different crises. The thing that distinguished the crisis that became a real problem for a company in terms of market share, reputation, was that the initial response was fumbled. They screwed up the initial response, and it didn't happen. What's interesting is it didn't happen 50% of the time or 70% of the time. It happened 100% of the time. And it comes back, and most of the time it was because there was this sense that, you know, let's say as little as possible and maybe this will go away. And that gets to your point, Laura, about the importance of, you know, the way lawyers rely on the no comment and the importance of kind of getting through that barrier. You know, and a lot of times you don't have complete information up front. And so the natural inclination is, well, let's gather our facts first and then we'll respond. But, you know, that in responding publicly, minutes and hours matter, you know, which is it's something that lawyers sometimes don't understand either. And even if you don't have full information, you can say something. You know, there's an attorney in New York, Ted Wells, Paul Weiss Rifkin, very famous attorney. And he said, well, basically what you're telling us to do is dress up no comment as a comment. And that, to a certain extent, you're not doing exactly that, but what you're doing is you're letting people know you're on the job and you understand the importance of what's going on. You're collecting information. And when you find out more, you get back to them. And that is a comment. And that does begin to reassure your audience. And Effie, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think when you consider the fact that you know, the news cycle is quicker now, people are expecting information in a lot faster pace than they would have even, you know, 5 years ago, and don't even kind of go beyond that. That's certainly the quickness that you can respond, even if it is sort of demonstrate the initial response is one that is demonstrating an intent and a willingness. You're kind of establishing your character, if you will, in that initial response, knowing full well that there is going to be a need to assess and get more information.
Have either of you, Jim, you spoke about breaking through the barrier of the, you know, the normal instinct to, you know, to just protect the company by not taking a position. Have you seen, or what do you think are the most important factors to break through that barrier? Do you think it's just, is it just mental acknowledgement, or are there other factors that you've seen that have been particularly effective in trying to break down those barriers?
Well, a lot of it comes to the relationship between communicators and lawyers, in that lawyers are trained to argue. And if you're not arguing with them in a polite way, they're going to not respond at all. And so when a lawyer comes out and says initially, you know what we do in this situation, we say nothing. You know, there's a tendency in PR departments to go, well, that's the lawyer speaking. There must be legal reasons why this is going on. And I should point out that I'm both a lawyer and a PR person, so I tend to pick on both practitioners pretty steadily. But there is that sort of, and you know, it's a little bit of knee-jerkism. You're in the middle of an incredibly tense situation that has the safety ramifications sometimes, that has legal ramifications, that have product and business and market share ramifications, investor ramifications. And so there's all of this going on. And sometimes the easiest response is to just say, listen, we have nothing to say at this point till we gather information. And you really have to push and press. Can you say this, you know, to the general counsel? Well, I suppose we can say that. You know, I'll give you actually a real example. I was called once by a company who'd had an employee commit suicide just after resolving an employment dispute. And I had never met the general counsel before. And the general counsel said, listen, there's a news crew that wants to interview us on this issue. And I said, well, where are they? And they said, well, they're standing right next to me. You know, and I had them put me on hold, and they put them in a conference room. I came back, and the initial response was, well, we can't say anything. There's so many issues here. You know, well, can you express sympathy for the fact that this has happened? I suppose we could do that. You know, and we went through a list of things that, between no comment and causing problems, there's an enormous amount you can say. And I think that's a key point.
One thing that I used to have with my general counsel when I was at the BSA is something we call channel markers. And this is sort of the regular course of practice. And so when we were in the crisis scenario, the same approach applied, which was, my job was to bring the landscape. So thinking about, you know, if anybody's watching The Diplomat nowadays, it's sort of like the North, the South, the East, the West, right? Kind of bring the landscape, because my focus was thinking about reputation from a communications perspective and protecting the reputation of the organization in the here and now and in the future. And the GC was really kind of focused on channel markers. Okay, understanding that horizon, then where can we navigate based on what we have in front of us? Right. We don't know what may come up. And then kind of when we looked at that scenario, then we had a little bit of room to maneuver. And that may lend a segue now perfectly for Laura with regards to some of the other insights that we have.
Well, I think I completely agree with that. And I think, you know, first, over time, things have changed over time with respect to communication, just in the last 10 years. With social media and all of the other forms of, you know, sort of 24-hour communication. It used to be a newspaper or a reporter crew, and now it's everything. It could be the people in the cube down the hall. It could be anybody. talking about it. And I think one of the most important things to break through that barrier is, like I said, an understanding by the legal team that, sure, we need to protect the company, but there are some things, even without knowing how this will end, like remorse. Yeah, I'm sorry this happened. You know, we are sorry
Right.
this happened. We take this seriously. We are, you know, working to get to the bottom of this issue. We're, you know, those kinds of things. You know, you might have sort of a extreme legal position. Well, if I say I'm sorry, I'm accepting responsibility. Well, actually, if you say you're sorry, you're speaking about the situation regardless of fault. And so there are certain things where I think it really starts with your mindset of, listen, we want to, our reputation is as important as the outcome of this litigation. And if we sit here and say nothing to ultimately win in the courtroom, we might lose long before the trial. And so that understanding and mutuality of respect, I think, is critical, and openness on the part of the legal team and the communications team. It's not just the lawyers that need to be worked through. It's also the communications team respecting, okay, we're not going to go all the way and, you know, say,
Right.
you know, I mean, sometimes communications professionals just want to talk and they want to say a lot, and that's not always the right thing to do either. There is a happy medium in between the perspectives, which leads me to our second sort of fundamental thing that we talked about, which is the GC often plays the role of mediator in these situations. And again, a lot of what we're talking about is in a crisis, and oftentimes a crisis is legal in nature, some way or another. But the GC plays the role oftentimes as mediator, and how to get comfortable in the middle of that tug of war between maybe your outside counsel, your internal team, your internal comms, your external comms. Effie, have you had that experience? And would you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think it's between comms and I'll call it the management team, and within the management team, it's operations, because there's a delicate balance in all of this, right? So if we kind of say that, you know, by and large, let's say legal wants to say nothing because, you know, facts are kind of solidifying in a particular case. Communications wants to say something because we know the importance of being able to shape the story and not have the story be shaped for you. The next part of it is being able to deliver against what you say. So if you say that you are, you know, committed to health and safety, if you say that you are actively investigating or taking this seriously, then the organization needs to be able to fulfill that message. It's not just it's hollow, because we could think about a number of situations whereby organizations said those things and then it was weeks upon weeks before we heard anything else. And in that instance, the company was not able to deliver operationally based on what the message was. So it's really kind of not only being the mediator, but also kind of triangulating the capability of what, you know, it's what we want to say, but what we can deliver as well. And usually the GC is sort of standing right there in the middle of it, being able to navigate that and get the information from the respective functional areas to be able to deliver that.
I think that, and I would just add to that it's absolutely true, because the GC has sees the whole playing field. The problem sometimes with litigators, well, the problem with, let's start with communications department. They had a lot of things they wanted to do that day that had nothing to do with the crisis. And this is kind of getting in the way. And they may not necessarily be particularly schooled in crisis communications. You know, there's one of the things that people should throw out is reference to the cyanide and the Tylenol case as the gold standard for crisis response. That occurred in 1982. And among other things, I mean, there are two other things. There wasn't as much litigation at the time. In fact, there were very few lawsuits, if any, filed in the wake of that. And regulation and government didn't work its way into every aspect of our company. And then as to litigators, you know, they, for better or worse, they are thinking about what happens in the courtroom. And everything else, as the saying goes, is commentary. You know, they are, and you know, sometimes they don't want to say anything because they're worried down the road they might upset the judge, you know, by being too public in their response. You know, but they also, you know, are only concerned about what happens in the courtroom. And I've been in situations like this where, you know, there might have been in the courtroom, there might have been 100 million at stake. And because of a fumbled response, the company lost $650 million in market share within a week. Now you gain some of that back, but this seeing the whole playing field is the role, because what happens in crisis too is, as good as top communicators are at these various companies, it's the general counsel that's the quarterback in those situations. And I think that is something to understand. And you know, we can talk about planning a little bit, but getting everybody on the field together beforehand, before the crisis occurs, so that they trust. It's what Laura was talking about with trust, that they trust each other and the advice. I think that's critically important.
Yeah, that's a great segue into another point that we were talking about, which is developing relationships before there is a crisis. So, and those relationships include the relationships between the internal stakeholders, but also with respect to hiring or retaining crisis management firms. Now, the best laid plans can always go awry, and they in fact often do go awry, but establishing a relationship both between the internal stakeholders and the external communications team before a crisis occurs is something that certainly in my own experience has been very critical, and including having the legal, the GC or the head of litigation participate in the hiring process with the external communication team. I've done that myself in a number of different capacities, including, quite honestly, as a board member, because it is very important that people feel their opinions will be heard, and that the crisis communication team is dialed in to what the company is all about, not just communications on a particular issue, but what is the ethos of the company, and what will the company really be comfortable with. Have either of you had experiences like that turned out to be either advantageous or not?
I mean, I'll take it a step further. It's not just having the GC involved in potentially hiring an external communications agency or consultant, but to actually be in the decision-making kind of trifecta of hiring the in-house communicators, because oftentimes the reality is that not, as you mentioned, Jim, not everybody has the same level of crisis communications experience. When you're kind of thinking about an in-house role, particularly at senior levels, you want to make sure that the person that is taking on that role has some experience, and if they don't necessarily have the full breadth of experience, is the type of person that is going to be able to work with the GC and the legal team to take that on, because inevitably you always want to make sure that your lead comms person has the capability of taking that on. A crisis will happen. Hopefully it's small, but regardless, the times that we live in, between social media and reporters being everywhere thanks to our handy little cameras on our phones, we really need to make sure that we're always prepared for that.
Yeah, and I would add that I more often am hired by general counsel than by the communications department. Although it did, in the years ago, sometimes I would be hired by the legal department, particularly if it were a crisis that had particularly legal element, and they never even told the communications department. And the difficulty at the beginning was, to explain myself to the communications department, because they would say, "Why is this specialized PR person here?" Thankfully, communications now, I think, is the legal departments are understanding that communicators are part of the process. The internal communicators are part of the process as well. But inevitably, it comes through the legal department, I think, on both sides. And, sometimes it's working in conjunction with the company's existing public relations firm. And I think that, there's all sorts of practical issues there, in that the existing public relations firm thinks I'm trying to steal the business, and thankfully, and so one of the first things you do is you convince them that that's not the case, whether it's, investor related business or product business or what have you, but there has to be a level of trust at each step of the process. And I think, Effie, you make a great point that, and this is, years ago, it's almost as if corporate communications departments and legal departments grew up separately and rarely met each other, at least not in a significant way. And Laura, you mentioned it became a trend over the past decade that communications departments reported to the chief legal officer more and more often, because there is so much regulation and everything in the world. But I do think that having it go, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it is kind of interesting, because when we first did it in my company, when the communications department first started reporting to me, which was what, 12 years ago, the communications team at first was like, we have to report to a lawyer. I can't. Almost inconceivable that would be a positive or constructive relationship. And actually, as it's evolved over time, I think, again, recognizing the changing circumstances and all of the different ways that communication occurs, it actually makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
That everyone understands, again, each other's roles and responsibilities, and has an open mind to all different perspectives. One thing you said, Jim, about being hired by legal departments or hired by
Right.
by counsel, sort of triggered or brought me to what in my mind is one of the single most important things to take away. And that is, oftentimes communications teams are retained by the lawyers for privilege purposes. And the notion that the privilege will hold in a litigation is very, very shaky. And I've had a number of situations, where the case, in some ways, almost our resolution, our optionality was taken away because some of the worst documents came out of the communications departments. Not because there was bad intent or that they changed the facts, but there was a lot of scenario planning and, this and that, and the documents became very, very problematic. And so while a number of firms and companies do have the lawyers retain the PR people, and I think it's a fine practice, I think the one takeaway is to assume that their work product is going to remain privileged is one that can be really dicey. Have either of you had experience with that on your side?
Oh my gosh. I think that, it's interesting because many practicing lawyers have no idea of about privilege. And they think if you add just add me as a CC and that will cover privilege. And it's absolutely not the case. There is many times, and when you do scenario planning, you have to be very careful that you're not providing arguments for the other side as to what really went on. Well, if this isn't what went on, why did you create this document here that says exactly what it was that went on? And you have to, while you want to be given the rapid nature of response, you want to be prepared for various scenarios. You have to be very careful. And the other thing you have to be very careful about is spin doctors like myself want to impress the client that we know the levers to push and we have some insight into how this all works. And you see that in TV shows like Scandal, right? Where it was a crisis communicator, or the movie Michael Clayton with George Clooney was, there's some sort of level we're operating on, and we want to impress the client, whether it's an outside law firm, the general counsel, or the internal communications department with that. So we put a lot of, I don't, but there's a tendency to put a lot of stuff in there about all of the nefarious things you're going to do to straighten this out. And it just creates a nightmare because so many, everyone listening to this webinar knows that a lot of cases turn on stupid things said in email, and it just is amazing to me. And I've always said that you should have, when you attach an email, when you're supposed to attach something to an email and you don't, it says, would you like to attach something? I always thought there should be a button that says, do you really
Sure.
want to say this before you send an email? Because so much of litigation turns on the offhand remark or people trying to seem cool to each other. And that's particularly important to remember when you are both working internally and when you retain outside crisis communications counsel.
That sounds like it's Copilot's next feature is, are you sure you want to say
Yeah.
that?
It's gotten worse even now because of email is even becoming more obsolete, and now it's texting and
Oh my gosh.
all the rest of that, which is a form of just literal conversation, which just makes it even more challenging. And that brings me to our kind of our last collective point, which is defining who's in the room in a crisis in advance. And when there is a crisis, everybody wants to be in the room because in some part their value is if they're at the table, then they must be valuable, and if they're not at the table, then they must not be valuable. But figuring out who ultimately needs to be in the room in terms of managing crisis communication and who makes final decisions, I think are two absolutely critical things. And who's in the room, the smaller the number of people in the room, the more likely that you're going to have an effective response, because the more people you add to the mix, you could say, well, that'll make it better because everyone's got a different point of view. Well, everyone's got a different point of view, and time is of the essence. And so when you have those situations with 35 people in the room, it's very hard to come up with a crisp, clean communication in a timely manner. Have either of you seen that, or would you add to that?
I mean, I think that's right. And I think when you think about a crisis, you've got legal, you've got comms, you've got management, and then you have, respective agencies that they want their person in. So it can quickly turn into a cast of thousands. So it's definitely important to have that laid out in advance. We talked about not having scenarios laid out in advance, but having the decision maker, who's in the room, the cascade of how that information gets out there. That's what you can have in advance. That's what's vital, because that helps you on the expediency to be able to get the response out once you've been able to crystallize something that's actually true to what each respective department needs out of that statement.
Yeah, and I've been in situations where I walked into a conference room and there were no chairs anymore because there were so many people in the room sitting around the conference table, and so they had to run and get one. And everyone, because it's not just that you want to be included, everyone wants to add value, and so it becomes almost a seminar on how to respond. And in the meantime, I'm like, listen, the Wall Street Journal is going to be on this, and bloggers and social media, and we have to move quickly in figuring out what to do. And that's why when people think about crisis communications planning, it really is the structural elements that are important. I call it the plumbing, and then who's the plumber that's making these decisions. And I won't, to put it in a nice way, when the spaghetti hits the fan, you better have a good plumber, and you better have the plumbing in place to respond effectively. And that more, even, we talk about the speed of the modern crisis response. Even convening that initial conference call can sometimes take forever because someone's on a plane. And if you don't have the operational playbook on how to bring everyone together and make some decisions quickly, that's where problems really occur. I often think that that when I see could not be reached for comment in news reports, that it really means could not get their act together quickly enough to comment. And I think that's something important to remember.
I mean, the other thing too to keep in mind, not just speed and efficiency of processes, there's 35 people in the room, there's 35 people creating emails, documents, all kinds of things. And determining before there's a crisis, who really needs to be there. Obviously, there might be a subject, what I would say is a subject matter expert. So if it's a quality issue, maybe there's a quality person. If it's a commercial marketing issue, maybe it's a commercial marketing head. But, you know, functionally speaking, you should be able to identify the key decision makers, and it should be, you can count them on one hand, not many hands and feet. So with that, maybe we had some questions that were submitted in advance. And then obviously, as John said earlier, to the extent that anybody has questions based on what we've discussed so far, please feel free to submit them, and we'll try to respond to them if we can. The first question that we had that was submitted is, how do each of these functions incorporate investor relations, government affairs, to assure that shareholders and key stakeholders are considered when drafting external messages? In my situation, both of those departments also reported to me, and so that allowed for, you know, the ability to ensure that those perspectives were represented. Jim, I don't know if you have had experience with this and would have a comment on that, or Effie.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying everyone has to be, you know, that's the core, what I call the core communications team will include for public companies, the investor function. You know, for internal issues, it would include someone from the HR function. And they all have to be, their insights have to be included. But what inevitably happens is, you know, IR thinks about, just like litigators think about what happens in the courtroom, IR thinks only about shareholders and investors, and they're not seeing the big picture either. And so what's interesting is sometimes you know, as we learn about a new client, you know, there was one specific example when there was a biotech company that was creating drugs for children with rare diseases that were literally dying, and you go to their website and all you see is investor information. They're literally saving children, but all you can learn about them is the investor information, because from that investor mindset, that's all they're thinking about. And so that again becomes the general counsel's role, is to kind of bring it all together when they're in the room.
Yeah, and I'll say, oh, sorry, Laura. The other thing is, you know, thinking about, I've worked with corporations. I've also worked obviously with a nonprofit, and I think the similar approach applies with regards to donor relations. They're sort of, let's call it the shareholders in the nonprofit world. So making sure that your foundation teams or donor relations are in the same conversation, because they're going to need to take that message out to those that are core to making sure that the organization has the resources it needs in the future.
I think, you know, in some ways you could say, well, okay, it's critical that you just said to keep the number of people in the room to one hand, and then you just said external affairs and government affairs need to be in there, and so on and so on. I think in that situation, obviously it's easy if they all report to the same person, then, you know, that's easy. But if it isn't a function of the reporting relationship, but in that situation, I would say the GC has a key role in, let's say, if the GC is always going to be at the table, because all of these things involve legal, everything involves legal at some level. So the GC, you know, coming up with whatever the statement is, or the strategy, or the response, it's easy enough for the GC to, you know, make a phone call to the government affairs head or the IR head and say, here's what do you have anything? Not let's start over again, but this is what we're thinking.
Right.
Is there anything you have to add to this? Or is there anything that we're saying here that's going to cause a problem for you? And I think the GC plays a really important role in ensuring that all of those diverse perspectives are represented.
Yeah, that role
Right.
is
Yeah, and I think the minute we said that the room should be limited, we started adding people to the room. So I'm glad you bring that up, because that's critically important. I think those perspectives have to be in there. But again, it's not a seminar or a training session. It's actually creating the action plan for what you're going to do and what you're going to do now.
Okay. Another question that came in was, I have had challenges managing the need to comply with the legal canons of ethics and the perceived needs of the business to stretch the truth or understate a relevant risk. In the past, I have followed escalate and then exit. Is there a better way to do that?
Yeah, and this as a lawyer, I'll just tell you first, it's something I get all the time about how, how could any of this be ethical and, and or professional? You're really trying to, and this goes back to the whole point I made about scandal and my plate. We're not spinning the truth or stretching the truth isn't the question. We're trying to get accurate information out to the public, but in a manner that makes the mess smaller, which is ultimately in the goals of the organization. There's no, you bend the truth too much, it breaks, and spin doctors do nothing but get dizzy. What you're really trying to do is in any modern crisis, there's hundreds, if not thousands of data points that need to be distilled so the public understands in that proverbial 10 words or less what on earth is going on and what you're doing about it. And Effie, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I would say here is it's having that relationship. I'd say, if you're coming from a legal perspective, having that relationship with your communications counterpart could actually be really helpful in the situation. Because again, the communications counterpart should theoretically be looking at the long-term reputation, the relationships with the consumer, and with other stakeholders. And so when you're thinking about that, I have yet to find a situation whereby stretching the truth doesn't ultimately at some point land in a case or in a headline that ends up doing a lot more damage than it was ever, whatever it did in the short term is far outweighed with the damage that it does. So really kind of partnering with the communications person to highlight the fact that this is a long game of reputation, not a short game of stretching the truth.
I think there's I think, at sort of at the highest level, there is no place for stretching the truth or understating a risk. There is no place in good communication for that, but there's a certain degree of relativity to what is a stretch and what is an understate and what is, how, and so in order to ensure that the truth is not stretched, there's black, white, and gray, and most everything is gray. There's black and white, but you're generally operating in gray. And what one person thinks is stretching the truth, another person might think is vehemently stating the truth. And so if it's closer to black and white and it's stretched truth or understated risk, then surely speaking up about that and ensuring that the decision makers understand what that is, what the stretched truth is, or what the understated risk is, I think is definitely the responsibility, honestly, not just of a lawyer, of anybody on the team and the decision-making team. Because for a company to put out good communications, we want to go as far as we can. We want to protect the company, and stretching the truth or understating risk is not going to do that in the long run. But recognizing there is some relativity and a desire and a need to work together to try to come to the right solution or the right representation of the facts, I think is important to do and important to keep.
Agree.
Another question that we got is recommended ways to transition from in-house counsel to corporate comms role. I don't have either of you had that experience, or I can take that question.
Well, I think, just as someone who's a lawyer who also practices, there has to be a certain facility if you're with understanding the communications aspects of the world. Lawyers who are trained, it's like the old saying, you go to a surgeon, every answer involves surgery, right? If you're unable to pull yourself back from the legal function, if this was the question, I think then that creates a problem, because it's the once a lawyer, always a lawyer problem that goes on. But Effie, I'm sorry,
it could be, I could see kind of a transitional, and obviously I haven't had this experience because I think I might be the only person on the panel that isn't a lawyer. But I think that the role of like crisis comms and you know, being that sort of intermediary could be a very interesting way to create a transition and create expertise sort of in parallel.
I think I agree with both of that, and I think the most, the first thing to do is to express the interest and take the initiative, because at the end of the day, the company wants to have a good, solid comms team. They want to have a good, solid legal team, and it starts with interest and desire. And so, if you are an in-house lawyer and you are interested in moving into a purely comms role, the first thing I would do is raise that as a possibility and discuss that within your organization and with the comms team itself. If you're not going to add value in the comms function, that's going to be a function of like what your orientation is, and are you really open to learning how to be an effective comms person or not. But I'd say any comms team would welcome a lawyer who has expressed interest in learning that and is really open to trying to do that. And it starts with taking the initiative yourself to raise it as a possibility. And again, over the last decade, it's become much more common, than it used to. It used to be like two sides of the house that never meet in the hallway, and now it's not really like that, so much anymore. I don't know if there are any questions that have come in.
We do.
Yeah.
We have some questions that come in. So here's one for us. Should the board ever be involved in crisis response?
Laura, do you want to start as a someone thrust into that role on more than one occasion, I imagine?
That actually seems like a black and white question. And again, like I said, most everything is gray. Should a board be involved in crisis communications? It depends on exactly what the issue is. Look, at the end of the day, the board is the ultimate steward of the company, but the management makes the operational decisions, the CEO, the management team, and depending on what the issue is, sometimes I have had experience where the board has been involved, where a selected group of board members, maybe a special committee that has been formed, has weighed in. But in general, I would say the responsibility for the effective communication starts with the CEO and the management team, and the board plays more of a notification role than sending the draft statement to each one of the board members and asking them to comment on the proposed communication.
Yeah, and I would just add to that you're going to be, if you were in charge of crisis communication response, you're going to be second guessed. And I think that the GC ultimately reports to the CEO, who reports to the board. But there has to be a comfort level that everyone who's ever read a newspaper or watched CNN has an opinion about how to handle a situation, but there has to be a very clear line of authority and decision making, and there has to be a certain comfort level with the fact that it's a difficult situation and there is no silver bullet. You're minimizing damage.
So speaking of a difficult situation, we have a question with respect to employee layoffs. So I work closely with our comms and HR teams. I'd be interested in any perspectives on public comms about employee layoffs and best practices.
I didn't hear the last part of the question. I'm sorry.
So no, it's interested in perspective on public communications with respect to employee layoffs, any best practices we might have to offer.
Well, I'll just throw one. Assume, and this is, by the way, a good advice for any crisis situation. Assume any internal communication you send in your company is going to be seen by the outside world about 30 seconds after you send it. I think that's an important thing to understand. And also, it gets back to what Laura was saying about truth. Don't try to gild the lily to the extent that people are going to see right through it. They actually, these days, just invite everyone back into the office 5 days a week, and you won't have to do layoffs. Is sometimes the solution, but in any communications endeavor, you can sometimes be too clever by half, that you're going to find a way to put together the right words. It's another one of those difficult situations that you just have to be straightforward with when communicating.
I would say, echoing what you said, Jim, employee layoffs is another form of crisis, of sorts. And so the one thing that's unique about employee layoffs is the employees that are still remaining at the organization they're always a relevant stakeholder in a communications, but in an employee layoff, remembering that the employees that are still with the company are just as important as what you might say publicly about the employee layoff. And because employee layoffs in particular cause a great amount of organizational anxiety, because you might not be the person laid off, but your best friend or your colleague may have been laid off. And so what does this mean for me is always going to be the first thing that comes to mind after, well, I'm so sorry that person lost their job, but what about me? And so recognizing that the universe of stakeholders is uniquely situated to the employees that remain at the company too, and don't forget about them when you're figuring out what and how you're going to communicate about an employee layoff situation.
Yeah, and the other thing that I would say with regards to from a communications lens is that you want to also take a look and be mindful in that time period, because there's the layoff communications with respect to employees. There's how that's discussed internally, what's shared with the employees that are laid off. But then there's also the conversation with respect to what are your other channels, what are your other sort of voices saying in that time window. You want to be mindful of executive visibility, what leadership is saying. You want to be mindful of major, I'll call it campaigns, or what your socials are doing, because from the outside looking in, truthfully, is that theoretically everything should be talking and responding in the same spirit. And so if there's dissonance between what's going on in terms of the executive visibility channel versus a massive layoff, then you have reputational challenges that'll become an even bigger crisis.
Yeah. Are there any other questions?
There are very good ones.
Many. Okay.
All right. So here's one that I like. And Jim, I'm gonna hand it to you first. But are you saying that most communication plans are worthless if they go beyond plumbing issues?
No, I'm not saying. I would say, I'm going to say two things. One is, no, I'm not saying that, but I'm going to say that it's my belief that many crisis communications plans are worthless. I mean, it's a good exercise to go through, and I actually have a prop. Hold on.
A binder.
Yeah. This is not a communications plan, but most communications plans look like this, or the high-tech equivalent where it's somewhere on Teams or the internal server and no one can find it. And what happens is no one ever looks at it again after it's created. And the board, and I can tell you that maybe the board said we need a crisis communications plan. And so someone out and hired a PR firm to do that. And I will tell you, as an outside PR provider, there's a mindset sometimes that if a plan this big costs $10,000, then a plan this big must cost $50,000. And that is a real mistake. However, in addition to having the structural issues in place, there can be a sense of what we're going to do in various crises, including what kind of statements we're going to make. And one of the things that it heads off is one of the things we started off by saying is, if you have agreement from the team beforehand, blessed by the CEO, then when lawyers say, you know what you do, say nothing. Well, you've already put the plan in place, but the plan tends to be an action plan and not a gigantic document that winds up gathering dust on a shelf. So
yeah, most crisis communication plans do look like that binder, like a skinny binder or a fat binder. The reason that they tend to be worthless in the end is because the crisis takes shape in a different way and form exactly than you planned it out. but the first 3 pages in that binder are probably going to be critical because it's going to identify the key decision makers and their phone numbers and
Exactly right.
in the room. Okay, all the rest of the paper may or may not be relevant.
Right. And nobody knows where it is. And you know, it's funny, I had a client, a tech company actually, that had a crisis plan on the shelf and it was in one of their servers, but they had no idea where it was anymore. So every time something happened, they'd pull the binder out and try to find it and then retype what was in the binder. And this was a tech company doing that. You can, you know, you think they would have known better. So the less, the better. It should be, I always equate it to, in a football game, you see the head coach has that 1-page sheet with all the plays on it that you're going to execute immediately. And like you said, Laura, it's the first 3 to 5 pages. And then one last thing about crisis plans, it's an action plan. It's not a training document. So a lot of them you'll see, you know, 10 pages on what is a crisis and the history of crises and things of that nature. That's not what an action plan is. And that's something to bear in mind.
All right.
Well, I'm
Back on the screen. So
yep, that means the hour went by as fast as lightning, as always. Great presentation. I love these. You've actually inspired me to add a few more questions to my GC assessment so that I know what someone's done to be crisis prevention, and are they prepared for a crisis, or how they prepare for a crisis, as much as it's important, or probably even more important, to how they handle a crisis. And one thing from an interviewing tip standpoint, we're always prepping people. If you show signs of emotions or nerves on an interview, you're not ready to be the GC, because the GC needs to be that calm, cool, collected person when the crisis hits. So really important stuff. I love the prevention. Jim, I really took to heart that one comment you made, as far as if it's in writing, be prepared for it to be released to the press. So, you know, you definitely have to be very careful. This topic is so important. We've had so much interest in it. Our December webinar is going to just be an offshoot of what we're talking about today. And I know people are asking a lot of questions that aren't getting answered. And one of the things that we do, we have a new Gordon who runs our marketing department. Will do a really great job of taking all the content here and putting it into a white paper, as well as the recorded version. So a lot of these things that are questions will most likely get answered in that white paper. So take a look at our webinar next month, Essential Crisis Management Strategies, a General Counsel Playbook. I think that's dynamite to have, and even I'm interested to know what goes on behind the scenes. What should be the first move? How does that room get filled up, and how soon? Because I'm sure the clock's ticking as the evening news is reporting the story. You're looking to get an answer out as quick as possible. So anyway, very important stuff. We appreciate it. If anybody is looking for a coach or an advisor, or looking to fill a strategic position on their team, whether it's legal or compliance, please keep us in mind. The team is world-class that we've put together here, and you'll get the results that you're looking for. So happy Thanksgiving, everyone. We appreciate you showing up Friday before Thanksgiving. But it's a very important topic. And Jim and Effie, again, thank you so much for bringing your expertise to the table today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right, we'll see everyone soon.
thank you.